Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Bring That Beat Back, How Sampling Built Hip-Hop by Nate Patrin, narrated by David Sadzin. Introduction: The Art of the Loop. On April 17, 1966, Steve Reich took a young man's traumatized voice and transformed it into harrowing music. Daniel Ham was one of 6 black Harlem teenagers accused of being complicit in the stabbing death of used clothing store merchant Margaret Sugar 2 years before. And the Harlem Six, as they'd come to be known, were beaten so regularly and brutally by police and prison guards that they became indelible symbols for civil rights. In his essay, A Report from Occupied Territory, published in The Nation on July 11, 1966, James Baldwin put the situation into the starkest of words. People are destroyed very easily. Where is the civilization, and where, indeed, is the morality which can afford to destroy so many? But it was a recording from before that stabbing, after Ham and another teenager were arrested under flimsy pretext during a fracas around an overturned fruit stand, that symbolized just how deeply that destruction would resonate. Reich had completed an early example of tape manipulation as music in 1965, when he pitted 2 identical but asynchronous recordings of a Pentecostal street preacher against each other for the piece It's Gonna Rain, loops clicking in and out of orbit until meaning gave way to words, words gave way to rhythms, rhythms gave way to noise. It left enough of an impression that activist and author Truman Nelson, whose 1968 book, The Torture of Mothers, examined the tragic repercussions of the Harlem Six case, lent Reich 20 hours worth of tape-recorded interviews involving Ham, with the purpose of turning the collected recordings into a condensed recollection of their mistreatment at the hands of the police. Reich agreed to do the work for free, just as long as he could use one of the clips to make another loop experiment track. The track became Come Out, a 13-minute recording that manipulated a 4-second line from Ham's testimony about proving to a hospital that he'd been beaten by police. I had to, open the bruise up and let some of the bruised blood come out to show them. Those last 5 words were isolated by Reich, played through 2 different audio channels, and looped end to end as they gradually fell out of sync, creating a multi-layered echo effect. Come out to show them, come out to show them. A slowly expanding, droning chorus of rhythmic vocal patterns until the mechanical nature of the recording and the living, breathing voice are thoroughly intertwined. 37 years later, and nearly 3 decades after Ham was finally found not guilty after spending 8 years in prison, his voice was heard again, the same source, but to a vastly different end, in a song called America's Most Blunted, produced by Oxnard, California beatmaker MC Madlib from Madvillain, his team-up with rapper MF Doom. Ham's lines emerge in the first 30 or so seconds of the song from a fog of aluminum thunderstorm sound effects taken from the Detroit soul group Dramatics' February 1972 #1 soul single, In the Rain. Ham's line flips quickly to a truncated piece of the phase-shifting portion from Reich's Come Out, before being accompanied by a reverbed guitar strum, also from In the Rain, and then abruptly being cut off by a ragged cough, bong rip sound effects, and a snippet of a comedy monologue about the benefits of listening to music while stoned. It was a strange opening flourish, but by the 2003 release date of Madvillain's Money Folder, backed with America's Most Blunted single, it wasn't as avant-garde as Steve Reich was in the 60s. It was just hip-hop. How did we get from there to here? Incorporating found sound and manipulating it into another form entirely wasn't an unheard-of practice before hip-hop started. Everything from Buchanan and Goodman's 1956 single, The Flying Saucer, and its news report pop song punchlines, to the Beatles' conceptual sound collage Revolution 9 in 1968, prefigured the idea that repurposing pre-existing sounds in music could create new pieces of music in themselves. But these were typically works of comedy or uncommercial experiments, often meant to parody, belittle, or transcend the idea of actually being popular music. Sampling, however, especially as it existed in the context of hip-hop as it rose to prominence in the 1980s, has done more than any musical movement originated in the 20th century to maintain a continuum of popular music as a living document. And in the process, it's become one of the most successful and commercial strains of postmodern art. It's a deceptively simple technique. At its most basic, you simply take a piece of a pre-existing recording and manipulate it, making it repeat on a loop, altering the pitch, cutting it into pieces and reassembling it, to make something new. But from the very start, it was laden with complex and ever-mutating consequences in the worlds of cultural exchange, the music business, intellectual property, archival history, and even basic songwriting. By the end of the 1980s, the spread of sampling and its ability to dictate musical trends had become as crucial as the pop charts and the press in determining what pieces of music from bygone eras had the means to join a historical canon. Yet as time wore on, and trends in both production and copyright law made the original sampling methods obsolete, new ways had to be found of incorporating it, and newer meanings were found in those juxtapositions. So the story of sampling in hip-hop isn't quite as straightforward as your typical music history lesson. It has clear origin points, particularly the turntable-manning, record-spinning, hip-hop DJs of 1970s New York, whose real-time remixing of largely contemporaneous or otherwise recent songs emphasized and extended snapshot moments of a particularly strong beat. But where those points go is rarely a straight line, or a parabola, or even a constellation. Sampling was built off word of mouth, broken secrets, technological experiments, fierce competition, artful introspection, happy accidents, mimetic replication, strokes of good luck, DIY necessity, collector impulse, and unbridled fandom. And an entirely new movement could turn on the whims of one taste-making entity, an idiosyncratic figure or two, or even a crew that amassed experience and knowledge the same way they stocked their record crates. If there's one thing that ties together all these different threads, it's the power of recontextualization, of taking something that was neglected by the masses or oversaturated through fame and giving it a renewed presence in music that highlighted a new way of hearing it. Hip-hop reframed music as the meritocracy that charts, labels, and the industry couldn't. It created a place where the semi-forgotten soul singer Syl Johnson was every bit as central as an icon like James Brown, where once anonymous session players became as prized as the charismatic frontmen they played for, where critically derided or neglected genres, fusion jazz, arena rock, smooth 80s R&B, could all find a place in a new revolution. Just as long as it could move the rhythm, the track, and the body from simple head nods to all-out dance sessions, it didn't matter whether it originated from an ultra-scarce, private press 7D single or the highest-selling blockbuster albums of all time. Just start with the beat and go from there. Sampling, above all, has a way of warping time and space in the pursuit of an empathetic form of creation. It takes a snapshot of a particularly stirring piece of music and lets listeners hear it anew, nodding to the work of an original creator and the vision of its hip-hop reinterpreter all at once. Even the smallest fragments of sound can become something revolutionary, and the creators of these one-bar loop symphonies can bring people to musical epiphanies by the time you count to 4. Bring That Beat Back examines the history of sampling in hip-hop through the lens of 4 different artists: Grandmaster Flash as the popular face of the music's DJ-born origins, Prince Paul as an early champion of sampling's potential to elaborate on and rewrite music history, Dr. Dre as the superstar who personified the rise of a stylistically distinct regional sound while blurring the lines between sampling and composition, and Madlib as the underground experimentalist and record collector antiquarian who constantly broke the rules of what the mainstream expected from hip-hop. From these four artists' histories and the stories of the people who collaborated, competed, and evolved with them, this book aims to provide a foundational introduction to a side of music that's often been belittled, insulted, or taken for granted. The aesthetic and reconstructive power of one of the most revelatory forms of pop culture to ever emerge from post-war 20th century America. And you can nod your head to it. Part 1. The Grandmaster. 1. Wheels of Steel. How DJs became artists. The dawn of hip-hop turns the DJ into a performer and curation into an art form, one break at a time. Before everything else, the sampler, the remix, the entire concept of hip-hop, there was the DJ. Here you have a figure who stands overlooking a dance floor with a few crates full of records, watching people react and move to whatever gets put on the turntable. And that turntable can manipulate people. Find a hot song, and you can pack the floor. Isolate the best part of that song, and you can build a peak. Make a thing out of finding that best part, manipulate it, reshape it, distort it, rewind it, extend it beyond any preconceived notion of just how long that groove was able to go. And the head-to-feet connection gets all wrapped up in a feedback loop that makes moving to a beat feel like an epiphany. The idea of the disc jockey as an in-house attraction dates back to the discotheques of Europe, though it's more accurate to say that the records the DJ played were the actual draw. In post-war France, the novelty of bars that featured jukeboxes in the early 50s soon evolved into trendy hangouts for European jet-setters, hitting a fever pitch in the early 60s when the twist craze spiked demand for dance floor space. But New York is where it really became an art form. While the transatlantic high society celebrities and beautiful people that populated early European-style mid-60s discotheques in New York City were getting down to Motown hits in pop art palaces like Arthur and the Electric Circus, the club scene's tendency to lean on shutting up and playing the hits had shifted by the turn of the 70s to something a bit more personality-driven and idiosyncratic. Francis Grasso, a resident DJ at the Hell's Kitchen gay nightclub, The Sanctuary, pulled off an important twofer. First, he played and subsequently popularized imports and obscurities, giving the people not just what they wanted, but what they didn't know they wanted even more. Then he mixed it all together in a sort of musical narrative journey that incorporated one of the earliest known forms of beat matching. His selections didn't merely segue from one outro to the next intro. They were layered and juxtaposed in a more streamlined fashion. In some cases, Grasso would spin two copies of the same record, holding one at a specific cue and waiting for just the right moment to let it spin back up again, all to make the grooves of his favorite, hard-hitting funk and rock jams last as long as he felt was necessary to keep people dancing. If Grasso's technique was the prototype for what New York nightclubs eventually turned into disco, it was also widely shared as a common ancestry with the DJs that hip-hop founding fathers would take their cues from a few years down the line. One pre-hip-hop favorite was Cameron Flowers, better known as Grandmaster Flowers, a DJ who opened for James Brown at Yankee Stadium in 1969 and spent much of the 70s throwing mobile DJ parties in the outer boroughs. As undercredited as he is today, Flowers was one of New York's most widely traveled DJs, renowned for his top-notch mixing skills and his ability to cater to both bougie Manhattan disco audiences and inner-city crowds that gathered in public recreation-field park jams. Not many recordings exist of his sets, and the ones that do come from the late 70s when he was competing against the newer generation of hip-hop DJs. But you can hear why old heads swear up and down by his mixes. DJ Hollywood, another disco crossover DJ who flourished beginning in the early 70s, spun at some of Harlem's biggest clubs, where he earned such a rep that he could make 8-track tapes off one-off mixes and sell them for $12 apiece, more than $70 in current money. And his place in history was assured when he became recognized as the first DJ to incorporate the same poetic rhythm talk stage pattern that black radio DJs like WWRL's soul server Hank Spann and WBLS's Frankie Crocker used, focusing on riding the beat with a more continuous flow of rhymes and leading call and response segments with the crowd. There were still debates as to who the first actual rapper was, but it's safe to say Hollywood helped plant the roots for a form of rapping that audiences would come to know by the end of the 70s. And it's still worth noting that DJing and MCing weren't always mutually exclusive parts of a performance. Yet something separated the Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens DJs from the ones who would eventually turn the Bronx into hip-hop's most formative battleground. After the Cross-Bronx Expressway severed the middle-class lifelines that kept the borough together, decades' worth of underfunded public housing, neglectful landlords, and street gang violence had come to define the Bronx as a no-man's land. If an emerging subculture was going to flourish in the Bronx, it would carry a similar air of youthful restlessness in the face of this decaying, but loyalty-demanding homestead, somewhere between an escape, a rebellion, and a celebration. The uptown clubs where DJs like Hollywood spun catered to a more adult clientele, one with money and tastes that ran toward the opulent orchestral soul of Isaac Hayes, Barry White, and the groups of Philadelphia International Records like the OJs and Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. But Bronx audiences skewed younger, tougher, and more intensely competitive. They didn't just dance to be seen or pick up partners, but also danced to battle, whether they represented a gang like the Savage Skulls or just a tight-knit crew of locals into the graffiti scene. And the cuts they demanded were heavier, nastier, and rocked harder than the rest. Fuzzed-out, Latin percussion-laced anthems by cult funk artists like the Jimmy Castor Bunch, It's Just Begun, Mandrill, Fence Walk, and Dennis Coffey, Scorpio. All it took was one DJ to capitalize on this demand, and an almost complete unknown did just that, combining right place, right time luck with a powerful command of the crowd and a monster sound system. Clive Campbell was part of the wave of Caribbean immigrants who arrived in New York between the mid-50s and late 60s. A Kingston-born kid who landed in the Bronx at 12 years old and aimed to follow in the footsteps of his father's own soundman business. By high school, he'd fashioned himself a memorable alias, combining the name he used tagging graffiti, Cool, from the cigarette brand, a suave James Bond-style spot advertised on TV, and a nickname earned on the basketball court, Herc, from his formidable height and Herculean prowess in the paint. And though his predecessors and rivals outside the Bronx will enthusiastically contest this, DJ Kool Herc offered one of the rare occasions where the birth of a subculture can be directly traced to a single specific date, place, and time. 9 p.m., August 11th, 1973, at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, right off the expressway that tore the Bronx apart. Herc charged admission for a rec room party held in conjunction with his sister Cindy, a special back-to-school jam, 25 cents for ladies, 50 cents for fellas, organized to raise funds so Cindy could buy some fly new clothes for the upcoming semester. The 18-year-old Herc had worked hard to downplay his roots due to local mockery. Before the outlaw cachet of Bob Marley and The Harder They Come made being a Rasta cool, local gang members were said to be throwing Jamaican kids into trash cans. But he still felt echoes of the massive sound systems he heard from blocks away as a kid back in Kingston, and started his set off with a few reggae tracks. The mostly high school-aged crowd remained unmoved, so Herc had to switch his style up quick. Fortunately for his young DJ career, Herc had learned from studying dance floor showdowns elsewhere that the kids wanted breaks. The break is what people now call the part of a record where the music gets heaviest on percussion, unaccompanied or otherwise, and acts almost like a signal to throw down and show your best moves. Unlike the grown-up crowds that the no sneakers allowed clubs catered to, the younger dancers lived and died by the break, using it as a key moment to show off the most elaborate maneuvers they could muster. Upright dance moves wildly transitioning into body upending, floor-hitting horizontal contortions that took style to new acrobatic lengths. So Herc gave them breaks, stretching seconds into minutes, a handful of bars into a whole breakdown, a mix into a stream of consciousness. He used the same technique that most DJs from Grasso onward did, queuing up a second copy of the same record to keep the break going in a loop once the first record reached the end of the breakdown, and added his own DJ patter over the mix through an echo chamber, giving the party the feel of a cavernous outdoor sound system transplanted from a Kingston yard into a Bronx rec room. Some cuts could do the job on their own. Booker T and the MG's 1971 instrumental Melting Pot, a popular choice held down by a ruthless Here Comes the Cavalry Al Jackson Jr. drum beat, was pretty much nothing but 8+ minutes worth of break. But Herc's big innovation was to string together a series of different songs breaks into what he called the merry-go-round, a combination of technique and selection that proved to be the foundation of hip-hop beats. The running order of the merry-go-round and what tracks it used could vary depending on whether the crowd was feeling it, but it usually had some common threads. For James Brown's Give It Up or Turn It Loose from 1970's Sex Machine, Herc focused square on a break about 2/3 of the way through that was almost entirely clapping, Johnny Griggs, conga drums, and James shouting, "Clap your hands, stomp your feet, in the jungle, brother," before the rolling thunder drums of Clyde Stubblefield burst in. There was The Mexican, an up-tempo prog rock goes funky number with Ennio Morricone spaghetti western flourishes, by English obscurities and Pink Floyd label mates, Babe Ruth. The drums were powerful, but it had a monster of a bass line during the break, too. Herc also swore by a couple cuts by Michael Viner's Incredible Bongo Band, an MGM studio group first formed to soundtrack the preposterous 1972 race relations sci-fi flick The Thing with Two Heads. Tagline, they transplanted a white bigot's head onto a soul brother's body. Bongo Rock 73, more popularly known as just Bongo Rock, was a key selection, with blistering Latin rhythms turning the titular drum into the sounds of a dance-provoking avalanche of percussion. But often Herc would mix it up or just swap it out entirely for another track from the same 1973 album, Bongo Rock, a version of the Shadows' rock instrumental, Apache, that had even heavier, more frantic beats, the atom bomb in Herc's arsenal that every other DJ had to stock up on in their own arms race in order to keep pace. Apache would eventually become one of the most recognizable beats to ever emerge out of hip-hop's new canon of dance music, going on to be sampled or otherwise interpolated in well over 500 acknowledged songs. As revolutions went, Herc's merry-go-round was pretty seat of the pants, but it proved to be a powerful blueprint to follow. Following, however, proved easier than copying. As far as his selections went, Herc made a point of removing the labels from his records. Soaking them off with hot water usually did the trick, and keeping them in nondescript sleeves so nobody else could capitalize on his discoveries. And even if word got out, who could compete with his sound system? What money Herc made typically went towards his tools of the trade: new records, bigger speakers, more top-of-the-line turntables, until he manned a mobile unit that outdid any sound system in New York City, and most of them in Jamaica for good measure. In '74, he'd moved from the rec room to block parties and park jams, and from there to a steady gig doing sets at clubs like the Twilight Zone, the Havalo, and the Executive Playhouse, until he ruled the Bronx nightlife in '76, with early adopter MC Coke La Rock bigging him up on the mic. Herc called his crew of assorted MCs and B-boys the Herculords, and his system the Herculoids. The speakers were colossal Shure columns, taller than most of the people in the crowd, while the amplifiers were a pair of Macintosh MC2300 solid-state amps, the same kind the Grateful Dead used in 1974 for their gargantuan wall of sound PA system. And most crucially, the turntables were state-of-the-art Thorins, $1,000 apiece, and shrouded in exotic German import mystery. A brand nobody else had, with one fateful advantage. Whereas most turntables of the day spun with a belt-driven mechanism that made cutting and cueing a bit stiff, the direct-drive Thorins were easy to spin up or spin back manually, were far more vibration and skip-resistant, and could stop and start on a dime. This gave Herc a head start on other DJs, who had to wait until the more affordable and available Technics 1200 caught on in the wider market, at which point it was still nearly impossible to match his system in power. One of Herc's peers, said to be an attendee at the famous 1520 Sedgwick party, was a fellow child of West Indian immigrants who went by the name Africa Bambaataa, a legendary DJ in his own right. Bambaata's crew-turned-movement, the Zulu Nation, transformed the reformed gang the Black Spades into a battalion of hip-hop activists that organized parties and cultural events throughout the Bronx, then all of New York, until their Afrocentric perspective permeated global hip-hop thoroughly by the end of the 80s. Whereas Herc set himself apart as the DJ with the best sound system, the up-and-coming Bambaataa, who played his first gig at the Bronx River Community Center in November of '76, made his name through his eclecticism. Bam didn't just unearth breaks from funk and R&B. He subscribed to disco pools and caught on to what was going on in the more esoteric corners of clubland, while simultaneously raiding the annals of classic rock and new wave for breaks. Kraftwerk rubbing elbows with the Rolling Stones, the Beatles with the B-52s. DJ sets were one thing, but the competitive, post-gang nature of the Bronx demanded DJ battles, and a battle at the Webster Avenue Police Athletic League best personified Herc and Bam's different approaches in one outlandish showdown circa 1977. As Zulu Nation member and DJ Jazzy J recalled it, Herc took so long to set up his massive system that Bambaata's crew used it as an excuse to keep their set going into overtime, playing well past the slot they'd been allotted, and showing off all the rare and obscure breaks in Bam's crates. Herc was clearly annoyed, but he couldn't say he didn't warn them. He turned his echoplex up and began to intone, over and over, "Bambaataa, could you please turn your system down?" And with every time the request was ignored, Herc just cranked it louder, made the echo boom deeper, sent the reverb shaking further, repeating, "Bambaataa, turn your system down," with the voice of a sound clash god, one man's booming...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?